When I caught my husband cheating, I thought I would be furious, but instead I found myself joining in the game. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. I've decided to share my story and expose my husband's betrayal, along with the way I got my revenge. My name is Fabiana, I'm 32 years old, and I currently live in São Paulo with my husband, Fabricio. We've been married for 10 years, and we're both the same age. Our relationship started back when we were teenagers, having met in school. From the very beginning, our relationship was a roller coaster of emotions, full of ups and downs, yet we chose to stay together despite the challenges. Since I was a child, I dreamt of becoming a flight attendant. It was a deep desire to travel the world, explore new places, and immerse myself in different cultures. When I finally started pursuing that career, my dream became a reality, but it also brought new challenges to my relationship with Fabricio. At first, things were tense. I was young, full of energy, and people often said I was very attractive. Meanwhile, Fabricio was constantly jealous. The thought of me flying all over the world, meeting people from different cities and countries, stirred something dark within him. It wasn't easy for him to deal with the idea of me jet-setting to exotic locations while he stayed home, feeling insecure and imagining I might be up to something behind his back. Fabricio's jealousy wasn't unfounded. It stemmed from his fear of losing me. He was afraid that my busy, adventurous life would pull us apart. I understood his concerns, but my dream was too powerful to let go of, and that often put us in difficult situations. After many arguments and a lot of patience, Fabricio slowly began to accept my career and grew more accustomed to my hectic schedule. The jealousy faded, replaced by frustration about my frequent absences, but there was nothing we could do. This was my job. The only other option would be a breakup, but we never had that conversation, even though deep down I knew it might lead to that. By early 2024, things had settled down, or so I thought. I was on another work trip, flying to Pernambuco. The commercial flight was proceeding as usual, and once we landed, I was preparing for my next flight in a few hours. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a missed call from my friend Flavia. She never called without a reason, so I immediately felt anxious. I tried to return the call, but the signal was weak. Nervous, I connected to the airport's Wi-Fi and checked my messages. Suddenly, my phone blew up with notifications, all from Flavia. She had sent photos, videos, and voice notes. Curious and uneasy, I opened the images. They were photos of my house. At first, I didn't understand what was happening, but a knot began forming in my stomach. I played the voice notes, and Flavia's worried voice filled my ears. "Hey, I hate to break it to you like this, but I have to tell you, there's a woman at your house with your husband. I recorded everything for you to see. I know it's hard, but you deserve to know what's going on." My heart sank. I was frozen in place in the middle of the airport, unable to react. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, my husband in our home with another woman. The sadness hit me like a stone, but was quickly replaced by a rising fury. I looked around at the people moving about, living their lives as though nothing was wrong, while my world had collapsed in just a matter of minutes. I had no idea what to do. I sat down, my hands shaking as I listened to the rest of the voice notes. Flavia had seen them, Fabricio and this woman, entering my house, already kissing at the front door. Every word hit me like a punch to the gut. Anger and sadness churned inside me, forming a knot I couldn't untangle. I wanted to scream, but I could only stare blankly at my phone, hoping that somehow this was all just a nightmare I'd wake up from. After taking a deep breath, I decided to remain calm. Instead of confronting Fabricio right away, I began formulating a plan. I wouldn't let him get away with this. He might think I was clueless, but soon enough, he would realize that he'd messed with the wrong person. The betrayal burned deep, but I was determined not to act on impulse. Revenge, after all, is a dish best served cold. First, I installed hidden cameras throughout our house in places Fabricio would never suspect. I needed concrete proof, something undeniable. If he thought he could lie his way out of this, he was sorely mistaken. I synced. the cameras to my phone so I could monitor everything remotely. 3 days passed, and it was time for my next work trip. As usual, I kissed Fabrizio goodbye, pretending everything was normal. But I was far from okay. The second I boarded my flight, I started watching the live feed from my house. Hours later, my suspicions were confirmed. Fabrizio wasn't alone. That woman was back, and they were laughing and acting like a couple in my home, as if nothing was wrong. My blood boiled, but I wasn't devastated anymore. I was ready. When I returned home, I didn't confront him right away. I acted sweet, loving, just like always. But when the moment was right, I pulled out my phone and showed him the footage. First, the video of him with the other woman, his face drained of colour. He stammered, trying to come up with excuses, but I cut him off. "You thought that was it?" I asked, a cold smile on my face. Then I showed him the second video, the one I had recorded of myself with someone else. His expression changed from guilt to shock, then rage. He was speechless, watching the evidence of my own betrayal. Just like he had betrayed me, I had done the same to him. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I felt in control. Fabrizio was stunned. He stood there, staring at the screen, his face twisted with a mix of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. He couldn't find the words to defend himself, nor could he look me in the eyes. He paced around the room like a caged animal, fists clenched, his chest rising and falling with every heavy breath. The silence between us was deafening, broken only by the sound of his shoes scuffing against the floor as he moved, searching for something to say, something that might change the inevitable. "Why?" he finally spat out, his voice hoarse as if he had been holding back a scream. "Why would you do this to me?" I laughed. The irony of his question was almost too much. "Why?" He had the audacity to ask, "Why?" after everything I had just shown him. "You really don't get it, do you?" I said, shaking my head. "You did this to us. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could lie and cheat and I'd never know?" He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off before he could say another word. "Don't bother. I don't care what excuse you come up with. I saw everything. And now you've seen what it feels like." For a moment he looked at me, his eyes wide with shock and pain, as if he'd just realized the full weight of what had happened. But then the shock gave way to fury. His jaw clenched tightly, and he stepped toward me, the veins in his neck bulging as his face flushed red with anger. But I stood my ground. "If you so much as touch me," I said calmly, "I'll make sure that video is sent to everyone you know. Your friends, your family, your colleagues. I'll destroy you." That stopped him in his tracks. He froze, his eyes narrowing into slits as he realized he had no power here. I had everything on him, the proof of his betrayal, the evidence of my revenge, and the upper hand in every way. "You're a monster," he finally hissed, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "Maybe," I replied coolly, "but I learned from the best." I turned my back on him, walking away from the mess that had once been our life. I didn't feel the need to explain myself further. There was nothing left to say. The damage was done, and we both knew it. I went to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and began packing my things. The sound of him pacing and muttering angrily behind me barely registered anymore. I was done. Done with him, done with the lies, done with everything. As I packed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Guilherme, the captain I'd spent that night with. He was asking when he could see me again. I smiled slightly, but it wasn't because of him. It was because for the first time in a long while, I felt free. Once my suitcase was packed, I walked past Fabrizio without a word. He was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, but I didn't care. I had made my point. I had taken back control. I called an Uber, and as I waited, I looked around the house one last time. It was a beautiful place, filled with memories of happier times. But those memories were tainted now. It was no longer a home. It was just a building full of lies. When the car arrived, I walked out the door without looking back. As we drove away, I felt lighter. I wasn't sure what the future held for me, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anyone make me feel powerless again. The game was over, and I had won. As the car sped through the city streets, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The chaos, the heartache, and the anger that had consumed me for days were fading into the background. I leaned back in the seat, my mind racing, but my heart lighter than it had been in a long time. The sense of closure was overwhelming, though I knew this was only the beginning of the next chapter in my life. My phone buzzed again. It was my mum. I hadn't told my parents the full story yet, but they knew something was wrong. Fabrizio and I had been a picture-perfect couple in their eyes for so long, and I wasn't ready to shatter that illusion just yet. "Hi, Mom," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sweetheart, are you okay? You haven't sounded like yourself lately," she said, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine," I lied, glancing out the window as the familiar streets of São Paulo blurred past. "I just need some time to think. I'll come over in a couple of days." She sighed softly. "All right, but remember, we're here if you need us, no matter what." "Thanks, Mom. I love you." I hung up, staring at the screen for a moment. The truth was, I wasn't ready to talk to anyone about what had happened. Not yet. I needed space. Time to figure out what my life would look like now. The idea of confronting my parents with the messy details of my marriage and my revenge felt too overwhelming. I knew they would support me, but I wasn't sure I wanted to see the disappointment in their eyes. As the Uber pulled up to the hotel I had booked for the night, I felt a pang of loneliness. I had always thought of myself as independent, strong enough to handle anything, but the weight of everything that had happened was starting to creep back in. Walking into the hotel lobby, I felt exposed, no longer the woman who had just enacted her revenge, but someone who had been deeply hurt, trying to hold it together. I checked in and made my way up to the room. It was a modest place, but it felt like a refuge, a small space where I could collect my thoughts without the suffocating presence of Fabrizio. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and flopped onto the bed, staring up at the ceiling. My phone buzzed again, and I saw another message from Guilherme. This time I left it unread. It wasn't about him. He had been a part of my plan, a way to reclaim my power, but I didn't feel anything for him. I wasn't looking for a relationship, not yet, and certainly not with someone I had used as a tool in my revenge. No, this was about me. I needed time to process everything, to figure out what I wanted. My career had always been a huge part of my identity, but now it felt like a burden. The constant travel, the time away from home. It had given Fabrizio the perfect opportunity to betray me. It had been a dream, but maybe it was time for something different. The thought hit me suddenly, and I sat up. Was it time for a change? For years, I had defined myself by my job and my marriage, but both of those things had become toxic, draining me of my happiness. I needed to find out who I was without them. I grabbed my laptop and started researching flight attendant job postings in other cities. Maybe a fresh start somewhere far from São Paulo would help me clear my head and find myself again. I could take some time to travel on my own terms, see the world for myself, without the pressures of work or a failing relationship dragging me down. The idea of leaving it all behind, of packing up and starting over, filled me with a kind of hope I hadn't felt in years. I had the chance to rebuild, to reinvent myself, and I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. The next few days passed in a blur of planning and quiet reflection. I visited my parents and told them about the separation, carefully avoiding the messier details. My mother cried, and my father's face tightened with anger, but they both promised to support me in whatever decision I made. It was comforting to know I had them in my corner. Meanwhile, Fabrizio tried to reach out several times, but I ignored his messages and calls. I didn't need to hear his apologies or excuses. I had made my peace with what happened, and there was no going back. He wasn't a part of my future. Then, one morning, as I sipped coffee on the balcony of my hotel room, I got a call from an airline in the United States that I had applied to on a whim. They were offering me a position based in New York City. The excitement bubbled up inside me as I thanked the recruiter and hung up the phone. This was it, the fresh start I had been waiting for. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane, but this time I wasn't working. I was flying to my new life, leaving the past behind me. As the plane ascended into the clouds, I glanced out the window, watching the familiar city of São Paulo fade into the distance. There was no more anger, no more regret. Just the wide-open sky ahead of me and a world of possibilities. This time, the flight wasn't just part of my job. It was my first step toward freedom. As the plane soared through the sky, I found myself gazing out of the window, watching the clouds drift by. A part of me was still in disbelief. In just a matter of weeks, my entire life had shifted. I was no longer bound to the past, to Fabricio, or to the life I thought I had wanted. Everything ahead felt new and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty excited me. The thought of starting over in New York City was both exhilarating and terrifying. The city was larger than life, full of energy, ambition, and people chasing their dreams. But that's exactly what I needed, a place where I could reinvent myself, where no one knew my past, and where I could be whoever I wanted to be. As the flight attendants came around with drinks, I smiled politely at them, remembering how I used to be in their shoes. For so long, that role had defined me. I had always loved flying, but now it felt like a chapter I was ready to close. I was no longer the woman tethered to someone else's insecurities or weighed down by betrayal. I was free to fly in a different way, towards a new future. When the plane touched down in New York, I felt an unexpected rush of emotion. This was it. I was really here, in the city that had been calling to me for so long. I took a deep breath as I gathered my bags and walked through the terminal. Everything around me felt vibrant, alive, like the city itself was buzzing with endless possibilities. I grabbed a cab and gave the address of the temporary apartment I had rented in the Lower East Side. The ride through the streets of Manhattan felt surreal. Towering buildings, people rushing by, yellow cabs darting in and out of traffic. The energy was palpable. It was a stark contrast to the life I had known in São Paulo, but in that moment, it felt like exactly where I needed to be. When I arrived at the apartment, I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The space was small but cozy, with a view of the bustling street below. I set my bags down and took it all in, the bare walls, the empty shelves. It was a blank canvas, much like my life. I could build it however I wanted, and that realization sent a thrill through me. The next few days were a whirlwind of settling in. I explored the city, getting lost in its streets, savoring the anonymity that came with being in a place where no one knew me. I started my new job with the airline, though this time I was in a managerial role. No more flying from city to city, no more long nights away from home. I was stationed in New York, a change I had embraced wholeheartedly. The transition wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of loneliness, times when I missed the comfort of familiarity, and days when I questioned if I had made the right decision. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself that this was my chance to start fresh, to live for myself and no one else. One evening, about a month after I had settled into my new life, I found myself sitting at a small cafe in Greenwich Village. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the city, and I watched as people walked by, lost in their own lives. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. As I sipped my coffee, I reflected on how far I had come. Fabricio was a distant memory now. He had tried to contact me a few more times after I left, but I had blocked his number, cut off all ties. There was nothing left to say. I had no interest in rehashing the past or explaining my actions. He didn't deserve my time or energy anymore. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Guilherme. A brief pang of guilt hit me when I saw his name, remembering how I had used him as part of my revenge. He didn't know the full story, and I hadn't stayed in touch after that night. Seeing his name now, I wondered if I owed him an explanation. But as I opened the message, I realized it was just a simple, "Hope you're doing well" text. I smiled, feeling a strange sense of closure. Guilherme was a good guy, but I wasn't interested in anything more. That part of my life was over, and I didn't need to go back. I typed a quick response, wishing him well, and then put my phone away. I leaned back in my chair, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the skyline. For the first time in a long time, I felt content. New York had welcomed me with open arms, and I was slowly finding my footing. Every day felt like a new adventure, a new opportunity to rediscover who I was. As the city lights began to twinkle around me, I realized that I wasn't just starting over. I was truly free. Free from the past, free from expectations, and free to create the life I wanted on my own terms. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. As the night deepened and the twinkling lights of the city illuminated the streets, I found myself still sitting in that small cafe, watching the world around me. There was a strange beauty in the way the city transformed after dark, vibrant, yet somehow intimate, as if each street held its own story. I felt like I was becoming part of the rhythm of New York, slowly adapting to its pace, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace with the unknown. I paid my bill and began walking back to my apartment. The cool evening air brushed against my skin, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I passed by shops and restaurants, all bustling with life. The loneliness I had feared when I first arrived no longer weighed on me. In fact, it felt liberating. This city was mine to explore, mine to conquer. Over the next few weeks, I settled further into my new life. Work kept me busy, and I found myself thriving in my new role. I had more responsibility, more control, and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. No longer tied to the exhausting routine of long-haul flights and endless hotel rooms, I could build roots. For the first time, I had stability, something I hadn't realized I craved. On the weekends, I wandered the city. I discovered hidden gems in neighborhoods I'd never heard of, tried foods from all corners of the world, and began to connect with the people around me. New York was starting to feel less like a temporary escape and more like home. Each day, the city revealed more of itself to me, and I reveled in the freedom that came with anonymity. No one here knew the Fabiana who had been betrayed, who had once been caught in a toxic relationship. Here, I was just me. And that was enough. One evening, as I was walking through Central Park, the leaves turning a vibrant shade of orange and gold, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw that it was my mother. I hadn't spoken to her much since moving, though we kept in touch through occasional texts. I knew she was still worried about me, but I needed the distance to figure things out on my own. "Hi, Mum," I answered, smiling as I stopped near a bench and watched a group of kids playing nearby. "Hi, sweetie. How's everything going?" Her voice was warm as always, but there was a hint of concern underneath. "We haven't heard from you in a while." "I'm doing great, actually," I said, realizing that I genuinely meant it. "Work's going well and the city, well, it's amazing. I think I finally found my rhythm here." "That's wonderful to hear," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Your father and I miss you, but we're so glad you're happy. You deserve it after everything." I leaned against a nearby tree, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs as I looked out over the park. "Thanks, Mum. I needed this change. It's been hard, but I'm figuring things out." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before she asked, "Have you heard anything from Fabrizio?" The mention of his name didn't sting as it once did. "No," I replied simply. "I haven't spoken to him since I left São Paulo, and I don't plan to." "That's probably for the best," she said softly. "He doesn't deserve another chance, not after what he did." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Yeah, I think we're both better off going our separate ways." We talked for a little while longer, catching up on family news, and by the time I hung up, I felt lighter. My parents were always my anchor, but now I felt secure in the knowledge that I could stand on my own, even in a city as vast and intimidating as New York. Days turned into weeks, and soon the chill of winter set in. The city transformed once again, and I embraced it all. The holiday lights that adorned the streets, the crispness in the air, and even the chaos of the crowds. I had made a few friends by then, co-workers and neighbours who invited me out for drinks or to explore new parts of the city. Little by little, my life was filling up with new connections, new experiences, and a sense of belonging I hadn't expected to find so quickly. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself wandering through a local bookstore, sipping a warm latte as I browsed the shelves. It had become one of my favourite weekend rituals, getting lost in books and letting my mind drift. I was reaching for a novel when someone's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Excuse me, are you Fabiana?" I turned, surprised to hear my name. A man stood there, holding a book in one hand and looking slightly hesitant, as if unsure whether to approach me. "Yes, that's me," I said, narrowing my eyes slightly, trying to place him. He smiled, a little sheepish. "I'm David. I work at the airline. You probably don't remember, but we met briefly at a company event a couple of weeks ago." I blinked, then it clicked. I had seen him in passing at a work event but hadn't spoken to him much beyond the usual polite introductions. I smiled back, suddenly more at ease. "Right, I remember. It's nice to see you again." We fell into easy conversation, talking about books and the city. It was refreshing, in a way that felt different from my past interactions. There was no agenda, no pressure, just two people getting to know each other. We ended up walking out of the bookstore together and grabbing dinner at a nearby cafe. That night, as I walked back to my apartment, my thoughts drifted to David. It wasn't like the whirlwind of emotion I'd felt with Fabrizio. This was slower, steadier, like a soft hum instead of a crash. And I liked that. I liked the idea of something real, something unhurried. Maybe, just maybe, I was ready to open up again. But this time, it would be on my terms. New York had become a place of new beginnings for me. And for the first time in a long while, I was excited about what might come next. As I walked back to my apartment that night, the cool winter air nipping at my cheeks, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since I had arrived in New York. Meeting David had been unexpected, but something about it felt natural, unforced. It wasn't the intense, all-consuming passion I had once associated with relationships. Instead, it felt more like a slow, steady current, something I could let myself get swept into without fear of drowning. David and I started seeing each other more frequently after that night. It began casually, grabbing coffee after work, bumping into each other at the office. But eventually, we started planning real dates. He was thoughtful, always listening more than speaking, and our conversations felt effortless. We'd talk about books, films, our dreams and our shared experiences in the airline industry. It was easy in a way that I hadn't known before. But even as I let myself enjoy his company, I was cautious. The hurt Fabrizio had caused wasn't something that disappeared overnight. Trust was something I was learning to rebuild, not just with others, but with myself. Every step I took with David felt like testing the waters. Was I ready to open myself up again? Could I let someone in without fearing they'd break me like before? One night, as we sat on the rooftop of my apartment building, overlooking the dazzling skyline of New York, David turned to me with a question that caught me off guard. "Fabiana, why did you leave São Paulo?" The question hung in the air between us. It wasn't that I had been hiding my past from him. I just hadn't felt ready to unpack it all yet. But the way he asked, gently and without pressure, made me feel like maybe it was time to share my story. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, and then I began. I told him about my career as a flight attendant, about Fabrizio, about the betrayal, and even about my plan for revenge. I didn't leave anything out. I watched David's face carefully as I spoke, half expecting judgment or shock. But instead, I saw only quiet understanding in his eyes. When I finished, he was silent for a moment, processing everything I had said. Then he reached for my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "That must have been incredibly hard," he said softly. but it sounds like you did what you needed to do to take back control of your life. And you've come a long way since then." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my chest. "I have, but sometimes I still wonder if I made the right decisions, if I could have handled things differently." David gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "We all have regrets about how we handle tough situations, but what matters is what you did afterward. You didn't let it define you. You started over on your own terms." His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had focused on the mess of my past, on how Fabrizio's betrayal had shattered my trust, and how my revenge, while empowering in the moment, had left me questioning my own actions. But David was right. I hadn't let it destroy me. I had picked up the pieces, moved across the world, and rebuilt my life from the ground up. Sitting there on that rooftop, looking out at the vast city below us, I realized something. I had healed more than I'd thought. I wasn't the same person who had arrived in New York, running from a broken marriage and the fallout of revenge. I had grown, learned, and rediscovered my own strength. As our relationship deepened, David continued to show me that not all love was complicated or painful. He respected my space, never pushing me to move faster than I was comfortable with. And slowly, I let myself trust him. We spent weekends exploring the city together, getting lost in Central Park, or trying new restaurants tucked away in small corners of the city. It felt good, grounded. One afternoon, as we strolled through the holiday markets in Bryant Park, sipping hot chocolate and admiring the twinkling lights, David paused and turned to me. "You know," he said, a small smile playing on his lips, "I never thought I'd meet someone like you here." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, "I've been in New York for a few years now and I've met a lot of people, but no one's ever made me feel the way you do. There's something different about you, Fabiana." His words made my heart flutter, but they also reminded me of the walls I had built around myself. I liked David a lot, but was I ready to let him in completely? "I'm still figuring things out," I said carefully, meeting his gaze. "I don't want to rush into anything." David nodded, his expression soft. "I know, and I'm not asking for anything more than what you're ready to give. I'm just really happy to have you in my life." His understanding melted some of the last barriers I had been holding on to. I smiled, and for the first time in a long while, I let myself fully embrace the possibility of something real and lasting. Maybe it wouldn't be perfect, and maybe I'd still have moments of doubt, but I was finally ready to move forward, slowly, on my own terms. The next few months passed in a blur of work, dates with David, and the steady rhythm of life in New York. Winter turned to spring, and with it came a sense of renewal. I had come to this city searching for a fresh start, and somewhere along the way, I had found more than just a new job or a new relationship. I had found myself again. One evening in early May, David and I stood on the same rooftop where I had shared my past with him months before. The city was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, and the warmth of the early summer air felt like a promise of brighter days ahead. As we stood there, looking out over the skyline, David took my hand again, just as he had that night. But this time, I felt no hesitation. I wasn't looking back at the past or wondering if I was making the right choice. For the first time in a long time, I was completely at peace with where I was and who I was with. I had come to New York looking for a new beginning. And now, as I stood there with David by my side, I knew I had found it. This was my life, one I had rebuilt piece by piece, and it was finally, truly mine. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about the future. Whatever it held, I was ready,